The corn in my grandparents' fields grows in perfect rows, but it doesn't grow corn. Every stalk stands exactly 6 feet tall, every leaf turned at the same angle toward the Maine sky. But when you push through the green curtain of vegetation, the ears contain things that were never meant to sprout from earth and seed. Some hold baby teeth arranged like kernels, still bloody at the roots. Others contain glass eyes that track your movement through the rows, watching with the patient attention of things that have been planted and are waiting to be harvested. Grandpa just smiles when I ask about the crop, patting my shoulder with hands that smell like fertilizer and old bones, telling me the land provides what the land needs. Grandma serves dinner every night with vegetables from the garden, tomatoes that pulse like hearts, carrots that whisper when you bite them, potatoes that bleed a thin, clear fluid that tastes like tears. They eat with the satisfied expressions of people who've learned not to question where their food comes from, as long as it keeps the soil rich and the harvest coming. My name is Ezra Thurston, and 3 weeks ago I was living in a studio apartment in Portland, stacking boxes at the Eastern Waterfront warehouse for $12 an hour. The eviction notice came on a Tuesday, printed on that yellow paper that landlords use when they want to make sure you understand your life is about to change. Mom had been dead for 6 months. Dad for 3 years before that. And suddenly I found myself with nowhere to go except the old Thurston farm in Aroostook County that I'd inherited but never visited. The drive up Route 1 through Calais took 4 hours in my rusted-out Subaru Forester, the heater rattling like loose teeth every time I hit a pothole. I'd called ahead, surprised when Grandpa Silas answered on the first ring with that same gravelly voice I remembered from childhood phone calls. He and Grandma Mercy had been farming the same 200 acres outside Massardi's since before I was born, raising crops that somehow always sold for enough to keep the property taxes paid and the lights on. "Course you can stay, boy," he'd said, and I could hear Grandma's voice in the background asking if I still liked blueberry pancakes. "Land's got plenty of room, well, there's some things you'll need to know about the farm. Some ways we do things here that might seem peculiar to city folk." I figured he meant chores, maybe some old-fashioned farming methods. Rural Maine has always been a place where people do things their own way, where families pass down traditions that don't make sense to outsiders, but keep working year after year. My great-grandfather built this farm during the Depression, and every generation since had managed to coax enough from the soil to survive. What I didn't expect was the list Grandma Mercy pressed into my hands the moment I walked through the kitchen door, her flour-dusted fingers leaving prints on the yellow notepad paper. 8 simple rules, written in her careful cursive, each one stranger than the last. "Now don't you worry about understanding them right away," she said, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses. "Just follow them exact, and everything will be fine." The first rule seemed innocent enough. Never eat anything from the garden after sunset. I should have driven back to Portland right then. The farmhouse kitchen smelled like wood smoke and something else. Something sweet and rotting that reminded me of overripe apples left too long in the cellar. Grandma Mercy bustled around the cast-iron stove, her movements sharp and efficient, despite her 78 years. She'd gained weight since the old family photos, her gray hair pinned back in a bun that revealed the deep lines carved into her neck. "Sit, sit," she commanded, pointing to the same oak table where my father used to do homework 40 years ago. The wood bore scars from decades of use, knife marks, water rings, and burns that formed patterns I couldn't quite decipher. "Silas will be in shortly. He's just finishing up with the evening feeding." I studied the list again, running my thumb over the creased paper. 1. Never eat anything from the garden after sunset. 2. Do not enter the barn between midnight and 4 a.m. 3. If you hear singing from the cornfield, plug your ears and go inside. 4. Never look directly at the scarecrow's face. 5. When milking Bessie, always fill exactly 3 buckets, no more, no less. 6. Do not dig anywhere on the property without asking first. 7. If the chickens all face the same direction, stay indoors until they scatter. 8. Never count the cows. Ever. Grandma, what do these mean? I held up the paper, watching her face for any sign of explanation. She paused, a wooden spoon halfway to her mouth for tasting. They mean what they say, child. Your great-grandfather learned these the hard way, and every Thurston since has followed them to the letter. She returned to stirring whatever bubbled in the pot. Keeps the farm prosperous, keeps the family safe. The back door creaked open, and Grandpa Silas stepped inside, stamping his boots on the worn welcome mat. He'd shrunk since I'd last seen him at Dad's funeral, his shoulders curved inward like parentheses. But his eyes still held that sharp intelligence I remembered. His coveralls were stained with what looked like mud, though it seemed too dark, too thick. Ezra boy. He crossed the kitchen in 3 strides, wrapping me in a hug that smelled like hay and copper pennies. Look at you, all grown up. Skinny as a fence post, though. Mercy, you need to fatten this one up. Already working on it, she replied, labeling something into 3 mismatched bowls. Venison stew with vegetables from the garden. I accepted the bowl gratefully, my stomach cramping from the drive and the stress of the last few weeks. The stew looked normal enough. Chunks of dark meat swimming in thick broth with carrots, potatoes, and what might have been turnips. The first spoonful tasted like home cooking, rich and savory. The second spoonful moved, not much, just a subtle shifting in my mouth, like the meat was trying to chew back. I forced myself to swallow, fighting the urge to spit it out. Grandpa and Grandma ate with obvious enjoyment, making satisfied sounds between bites. Good, isn't it? Grandpa asked, noticing my hesitation. Mercy's got a gift with seasoning, always has. I nodded, taking another careful bite. This time I was ready for the movement, the way the meat seemed to pulse against my teeth. Maybe it was just my imagination, stress from the move, exhaustion from the drive. People in rural areas process their own meat differently. Maybe that explained the texture. Tell me about the rules, I said, setting down my spoon. Some of them seem specific. Grandpa and Grandma exchanged a look across the table, one of those wordless conversations that married couples develop over decades. The farm's old, Ezra, Grandpa said finally. Older than our family's been working it. Some places, they've got their own ways, their own requirements. You respect those requirements, and the land takes care of you. Requirements from who? From what was here before us, Grandma answered, her voice soft but firm. What's still here, in the soil, in the roots? Your great-grandfather tried to farm this land the regular way when he first bought it. Lost 3 crops in a row, nearly lost the property to the bank. Then old Henrik Bjornsson from the next farm over came by. Grandpa continued. Told him about the rules his own family had learned from the Passamaquoddy who used to hunt these woods. Said the land would provide, but only if you listened to what it needed. Henrik, a Norwegian name, common enough in this part of Maine where Scandinavian immigrants had settled alongside the native tribes. It felt authentic, grounded in the area's history. What happened when he started following the rules? Best harvest season in county history, Grandma said, pride evident in her voice. Every year since, we've done better than the farms around us. Even during the droughts, even during the floods, The land provides. I glanced out the kitchen window as twilight settled over the fields. The corn stalks stood motionless in the still air, their tops barely visible in the gathering dusk. From this distance, they looked normal enough, just another farmer's crop waiting for harvest. "The first rule," I said, reading from the paper again, "about not eating from the garden after sunset. Why?" "Things change when the sun goes down," Grandpa said simply. "Food that nourishes during the day can, well, it serves different purposes after dark. Best to stick to preserved goods for evening meals." I thought about the tomatoes I'd seen in the garden, the way they seemed to glisten in the afternoon light. Had they been pulsing then? Or was that just something I'd imagined after reading the rules? "Don't worry yourself about understanding everything all at once," Grandma said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. Her skin felt cold, like she'd been handling ice. "Just follow the list, and you'll do fine. Plenty of young folks before you have learned to live with the land's ways." Outside, something began to sing. The sound drifted through the kitchen window like smoke, soft and melodic, rising from somewhere deep within the corn rows. It wasn't words exactly, more like humming that occasionally shaped itself into syllables that might have been a language once, before it forgot how to be human. Grandpa's spoon clattered against his bowl. "Mercy, get the cotton." Grandma was already moving, her chair scraping against the linoleum as she hurried to a drawer beside the sink. She pulled out a small mason jar filled with cotton balls, the kind you'd find in any medicine cabinet, except these had been soaked in something that smelled like pine needles and rust. "Here, child." She pressed 2 cotton balls into my palm, her fingers shaking slightly. "Push them deep into your ears. Don't listen to the words. Don't try to understand what it's saying." The singing grew louder, more complex. Multiple voices now, weaving together in harmonies that made my teeth ache. I could feel the sound trying to burrow into my thoughts, seeking something soft and vulnerable to nest in. I shoved the cotton balls into my ears, the pine scent filling my nostrils. The singing muffled, but didn't disappear entirely. It seemed to bypass my ears somehow, vibrating through my bones, my skull, the soft tissue behind my eyes. Grandpa had already plugged his own ears and was gesturing for us to move away from the window. We huddled in the living room, a cramped space dominated by a stone fireplace and furniture that remembered the 1970s. Family photos lined the mantelpiece. Weddings, graduations, children who'd grown up and moved away to places where the soil grew normal crops. The singing continued for 23 minutes. I counted, watching the brass clock on the mantelpiece tick away each second. The melody evolved, became more urgent, almost pleading. Through the muffled sound, I caught fragments that might have been my name, might have been invitations, might have been promises of things I'd never imagined wanting. When it finally stopped, the silence felt heavier than the song itself. Grandpa pulled out his cotton balls and motioned for us to do the same. "They're getting stronger," he said to Grandma, his voice low. "Used to be we'd only hear them during the harvest season." "More visitors lately," Grandma replied, gathering the used cotton balls and dropping them into the fireplace. They hissed and popped as they caught fire, releasing smoke that smelled like burning hair. Young folks from the university mostly. Anthropology students wanting to study rural folklore. They don't listen to warnings. "What happens if you don't plug your ears?" I asked, though part of me already knew I wouldn't like the answer. "You go to them," Grandpa said simply. "Walk right out into the corn rows and help with the harvest. Most folks anyway. Some are stronger, can resist longer." Henrik Bjornson's grandson lasted 3 days. Grandma added, stoking the fire with a poker. Kept trying to fight it, trying to logic his way out of what he was hearing. Found him eventually, standing in the middle of the field, trying to plant his own teeth in neat little rows. My mouth went dry. His teeth? Oh, he was still alive, Grandpa clarified as if that made it better. Happy as could be, talking about how he was finally contributing to the harvest. We had to tie him up, drive him to Eastern Maine Medical Center in Bangor, told the doctors he'd had some kind of breakdown, too much stress from graduate school. Did he get better? Define better, Grandma said. He's functional, holds down a job at an insurance office in Augusta, but he sends us a postcard every year around harvest time. Same message. I can still hear them singing. Save me a spot in the rows. I stared into the fire, watching the cotton balls dissolve into ash. How long has this been happening? Long as anyone can remember, Grandpa said. The Passamaquoddy called this area Kachiputuways, the place where the earth dreams. Said the soil here was different, richer. But that richness came with obligations. What kind of obligations? Grandma and Grandpa exchanged another one of their looks. The kind you don't question if you want to keep living here, Grandma said finally. The land gives, but it also takes. That's the bargain every farmer makes, whether they admit it or not. We're just more honest about the terms. She stood up, smoothing her apron. Now, I'll show you to your room. Tomorrow's going to be a busy day. Silas wants to introduce you to the animals, show you the proper way to handle the feeding schedule. My room was on the second floor, at the end of a hallway lined with more family photos. The bed was a simple iron frame with a quilt that had probably been sewn by my great-grandmother, the patterns faded, but still warm. A single window looked out over the farmyard, and beyond that, the cornfields. Even with the curtains drawn, I could see the stalks swaying in the night breeze, their movements too synchronized, too rhythmic. Like they were dancing the music only they could hear. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel the echo of that singing, vibrating in my bones. The pine-scented cotton had left a taste in my mouth, like Christmas trees and old blood. Outside, something scratched against the house. Probably just tree branches in the wind, but it sounded deliberate, like fingers tapping against the siding in a pattern I almost recognized. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and crept downstairs for a glass of water. The kitchen was dark except for the pale light filtering through the window above the sink. I filled a glass from the top, the water tasting of iron and minerals drawn from deep wells. That's when I noticed the back door was ajar. Just a crack, barely enough to let in the night air, but enough to show that someone, or something, had been through recently. I approached slowly, my bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. Through the gap, I could see a slice of the farmyard, the barn looming like a sleeping giant in the darkness. The barn where, according to rule number 2, I wasn't supposed to go between midnight and 4 a.m. I checked the kitchen clock, 12:47 a.m. As I reached for the door to close it properly, I heard footsteps in the gravel outside. Slow, shuffling steps that didn't quite match human rhythm. They paused directly outside the door, and I held my breath, my hand frozen on the doorknob. Through the crack, I saw a shadow pass by, then another, then a third, moving in single file toward the barn. The shapes were wrong somehow. Too tall in some places, too bent in others, like people who'd forgotten how their bodies were supposed to fit together. One of them stopped and turned toward the house. In the faint moonlight, I caught a glimpse of what might have been a face, if faces were made of corn husks and old bones and things that grew in dark soil. It tilted its head, listening, and I swore it smiled. Then it continued toward the barn, following the others into the darkness beyond. I closed the door as quietly as I could, turned the deadbolt, and backed away. My hands were shaking now, and I gripped the water glass like an anchor to reality. Whatever I'd just seen, whatever was happening in that barn right now, the rules said I shouldn't know about it. The clock ticked toward 1 a.m., and I realized I had 3 more hours until whatever was in there finished its business and returned to wherever such things went during daylight. I went back upstairs, pulled the quilt over my head, and tried very hard not to think about the way that thing had smiled when it looked at the house. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of corn rows that stretched on forever, and voices singing lullabies in a language made of earth and bone, and growing things that should never have learned to sing. Dawn crept across the farm like spilled milk, pale and thin, casting everything in shades of gray that made the familiar seem foreign. I woke to the sound of roosters crowing, though their calls had an edge to them, a harshness that reminded me of rusty hinges rather than barnyard songs. Grandma Mercy was already in the kitchen when I stumbled downstairs, her hands working dough on the counter with practiced efficiency. The smell of coffee filled the air, rich and earthy, masking that underlying sweetness I'd noticed the night before. "Morning, child," she said without looking up. "Silas is waiting for you in the barn. Best get some food in you first, though. Going to be a long day." She set a plate in front of me, scrambled eggs, bacon, and something that looked like hash browns, but had a reddish tint I couldn't place. The eggs tasted normal enough, but the bacon had that same moving quality as last night's stew, a subtle writhing between my teeth that made me swallow quickly. "The hash browns are parsnips from the garden," Grandma explained, noticing my hesitation. "Grew them special this year. Good for the constitution." I took a careful bite. They tasted like potatoes mixed with copper pennies, and when I chewed, I could swear I heard tiny voices whispering complaints. But it was daylight now, and rules were different during the day. At least that's what I told myself. The walk to the barn took me past the garden, where I got my first close look at the vegetables in morning light. The tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, their skin translucent enough to show the dark fluid pulsing inside. The carrots had been harvested recently. I could see the holes where they'd been pulled, each one perfectly round and too deep, as if the roots had gone down much further than any carrot should. But it was the corn that stopped me cold. In daylight, the wrongness was more obvious. Each stalk stood exactly the same height, their leaves angled at identical degrees toward the sky. But more than that, they were breathing. Slow, rhythmic expansions and contractions, like the entire field was one massive lung drawing air through 10,000 green throats. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Grandpa's voice came from behind me. I turned to find him watching the corn with the satisfaction of a man admiring his life's work. Took 3 generations to get them growing just right. Your great-grandfather started with regular seed corn from the agricultural station in Orono. But the land, well, it had suggestions for improvement. "They're breathing," I said, stating the obvious because I couldn't think of anything else to say. "Course they are. All growing things breathe, boy. Most folks just can't see it happening." He gestured toward the barn. "Come on. Bessie's waiting for her morning milking, and she gets cranky if we're late." The barn door stood open, revealing shadows that seemed deeper than they should be in the morning light. As we approached, I remembered rule number 4. Never look directly at the scarecrow's face. I saw it immediately, standing guard at the edge of the cornfield like a sentinel. It wore Grandpa's old overalls and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. Its arms stretched wide on a cross of weathered wood. The head was a burlap sack, stuffed with straw, crude features stitched in black thread. "Don't look at its face," Grandpa warned, though he said it casually, the way you might remind someone to close the gate behind them. Just good manners, really. Harold's been keeping watch over this farm since before you were born. Deserves his privacy. Harold. He'd named the scarecrow Harold. What happens if you look? Nothing good, Grandpa said, opening the barn door wider. Your cousin Jimmy found out when he was about 12. Spent the rest of his visit standing in that exact same spot, arms spread wide, not moving, not blinking. We had to wait until Harold decided to let him go. How long did that take? 3 days. Jimmy never did come back to visit after that. Inside the barn, the air hung thick with the smell of hay and animals, but underneath it lurked something else. That same sweetness from the house, concentrated and cloying. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the wooden walls, illuminating dust motes that danced in patterns too regular to be random. Bessie stood in her stall, a Holstein cow with the standard black and white markings, except her eyes were wrong, too intelligent, too aware. When she saw us, she turned her massive head and made a sound that was part moo, part something else, something that might have been trying to say my name. She likes you? Grandpa said, fetching 3 metal buckets from a shelf. That's good. Bessie can be particular about who she lets milk her. He demonstrated the process, his hands moving with the ease of decades of practice. The milk came out white and normal-looking, filling the first bucket with steady streams. But as he worked, I noticed Bessie wasn't just standing there passively. She was watching me over Grandpa's shoulder, her large brown eyes tracking my every movement. Rule number 5, Grandpa said, not looking up from his work. Always 3 buckets, no more, no less. Bessie knows how much she's supposed to give, and she'll stop when it's right. Try to take more and she gets upset. What kind of upset? The kind that involves hooves and a lot of regret. He finished filling the 2nd bucket and moved to position the 3rd. Happened to a young fellow from the county extension office a few years back. Came out here with some newfangled equipment, talking about increasing milk production through scientific methods. Bessie kicked him clear through the barn wall. The 3rd bucket filled, and Bessie made that sound again. The not quite moo that contained syllables that shouldn't have fit in a cow's throat. Then she turned away, dismissing us with the air of someone who'd completed their daily obligation. Now the chickens, Grandpa said, carrying 2 of the buckets while I managed the 3rd. The milk sloshed gently, and I noticed it was slightly warmer than it should be, almost body temperature. The chicken coop sat behind the barn, a rambling structure that looked like it had been added to and modified over the years. As we approached, I could hear the birds inside, making their usual clucking and squawking sounds. But when Grandpa opened the coop door, they all fell silent. 37 chickens stood in perfect rows, every head turned toward the east wall of the coop. Not one of them moved. Not one made a sound. They stood like feathered soldiers at attention, their black eyes reflecting the morning light with an eerie uniformity. Rule number 7, Grandpa whispered, backing away from the coop. When they all face the same direction, we stay indoors until they scatter. How long does this usually last? Anywhere from a few minutes to most of the day. Depends on what's got their attention. He closed the coop door carefully. Chickens are sensitive to things we can't see. When they line up like that, it means something's moving through the area that we don't want to notice us. We retreated to the house, leaving the milk buckets on the back porch. Through the kitchen window, we could see the chickens still maintaining their formation, heads all pointed in the same direction, like living compasses tracking something beyond our perception. "What are they looking at?" I asked. "Better not to know," Grandma said from her spot at the stove. "Some questions have answers that change you just for hearing them." We waited 2 hours. I spent the time helping Grandma with household chores, washing dishes, sweeping floors, mending a tear in one of Grandpa's work shirts. Normal domestic activities that should have been comforting but felt strange when performed, while waiting for supernatural chickens to give the all-clear signal. Finally, around 10 o'clock, the chickens began to move. First one, then another, until they were all scratching and pecking and carrying on like normal farm birds. The spell, whatever it was, had broken. "There we go," Grandpa said, visibly relaxing. "Now we can finish the morning chores." But as we headed back outside, I caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the cornfield. Something tall and dark slipping between the stalks, moving with a fluid grace that didn't match anything human. I only saw it for a second before it disappeared into the green maze, but that was enough. The chickens had been right to point eastward. Something had been moving through the area, something that cast no shadow despite the bright morning sun. "Grandpa," I started to say, but he held up a hand. "That's not to mention what you might have seen," he said quietly. "Some things prefer to go about their business without comment. Long as they keep to the corn rows and don't bother the livestock, we extend the same courtesy." I looked back at the cornfield, where the stalks continued their slow, rhythmic breathing. Whatever was in there, it was part of the farm's ecosystem now, just another element in the delicate balance that kept this place functioning. The rules weren't just guidelines for safety. They were terms of a contract negotiated over generations, an agreement between the human inhabitants and whatever else called this land home. And I was beginning to understand that breaking that contract would cost more than just a bad harvest. After lunch, a sandwich made with bread that tasted like it had been kneaded with tears and honey, Grandpa suggested I explore the property to get my bearings. "Just stay close to the house," he advised, adjusting his worn baseball cap. "And remember rule number 6. Do not dig anywhere on the property without asking first." I walked the perimeter of the farmyard, taking inventory of the outbuildings and equipment. There was a tool shed leaning slightly to one side, its roof patched with mismatched shingles. A chicken coop that had returned to normal after the morning's synchronized display. The barn with its 2 deep shadows. And beyond it all, the cornfield breathing its slow, steady rhythm. But it was the pasture that caught my attention. Rolling green fields dotted with cattle, maybe 15 or 20 head grazing peacefully in the afternoon heat. Black Angus mostly, with a few Herefords mixed in, all looking perfectly ordinary from a distance. Rule number 8 echoed in my head. Never count the cows. Ever. I found myself doing exactly what the rule warned against, my eyes automatically tallying the animals. 1 near the fence, 3 by the water trough, 5 clustered under an old oak tree. I caught myself at 11 and forced my gaze away, but the urge to finish counting was strong, almost compulsive. Smart boy. I spun around to find Grandpa approaching from the house, carrying a thermos and 2 metal cups. His weathered face showed approval, though there was something else in his expression. Relief, maybe. "Coffee break," he said, pouring steaming liquid into both cups. "Thought you might be getting curious about the herd." The coffee was black and bitter, with grounds that crunched between my teeth. What happens if you count them? Different things depending on how far you get. Grandpa settled onto a tree stump, his joints creaking like old wood. Most folks stop around 12 or 13, start feeling dizzy, confused. Smart ones take the hint and look away. What about the ones who don't stop? They finish counting. He sipped his coffee, staring out at the cattle. Problem is, the number's never the same twice. Count 15 one day, 23 the next, 8 the day after that. Same cows, mind you. Just different mathematics. I watched the cattle grazing, deliberately avoiding any attempt to enumerate them. They moved like normal cows, chewed like normal cows. But now that I knew not to count them, other details became apparent. The way their shadows fell at angles that didn't match the sun's position. How some of them seemed to occupy the same space without crowding each other. The soft sound they made when they mooed. Not quite the right pitch, like recordings played at the wrong speed. Henrik Bjornson's nephew tried counting them once, Grandpa continued. Stubborn kid, maybe 16 years old, said he was going to prove we were all just superstitious farmers playing mime games. That to 37 before he started screaming. 37? Kept pointing at spots where there weren't any cows, insisting he could see them clear as day. Told us about the ones with extra legs, the ones whose heads faced backward, the ones that were just skeletons held together with barbed wire and wishes. Grandpa drained his cup, spent 3 days at the hospital in Presque Isle before his vision went back to normal. A cloud passed over the sun, and for a moment the entire pasture seemed to shift. Not the landscape itself, but something deeper. The way space arranged itself, the relationship between here and there. I blinked and everything looked normal again. The land plays by different rules, Grandpa said, as if reading my thoughts. Always has. Your great-grandfather learned that the hard way when he first tried to expand the cattle operation. What did he do? Wanted to build a new fence line, extend the pasture closer to the woods, started digging post holes without asking permission first. Grandpa's voice dropped. Got about 3 feet down before his shovel hit something that shouldn't have been there. I waited, but he seemed lost in thought, staring at a spot near the fence where the grass grew in a different shade of green. What did he find? Roots, Grandpa said finally, but not from any tree or plant he recognized, thick as a man's arm, white as bone, and warm to the touch. When he tried to cut through them, they bled. The coffee suddenly tasted like copper pennies. Bled what? Same stuff that runs through our veins, near as he could tell. Red and thick and smelling like iron and fear. Grandpa stood up, brushing dust from his coveralls. Roots went down deeper than his shovel could reach, spread out in every direction, like the whole farm was sitting on top of some kind of, well, call it a network. A network of what? Something that's been here longer than any of us. Something that learned to work with humans instead of against them, long as we follow the agreement our families made. He collected the empty cups. Your great-grandfather filled in that hole real quick, planted grass over it, and never tried to dig anywhere else without asking first. Asking who? The land itself. You ask respectful-like. Explain what you need and why. Sometimes you get permission, sometimes you don't. But you always ask. As we walked back toward the house, I noticed something strange about the grass near the fence line. It grew in patterns, not geometric, not organized, but following lines that seemed to flow like water frozen in mid-motion. The different shades created a subtle map of something I couldn't quite interpret, veins of connection spreading beneath our feet. Grandpa, what's really under the soil here? He paused at the back door, his hand on the screen. Same thing that's under every farm, every town, every place humans have ever tried to make their mark. The difference is, we've learned to acknowledge it. Inside, Grandma was preparing dinner, her hands working with ingredients that looked almost normal until you watched them closely. The potatoes had eyes that blinked occasionally. The onions whispered when she cut them, releasing tears that weren't entirely her own. The meat in the pan sizzled and popped, forming patterns in the grease that reminded me of words in a language I'd never learned. "How was your walk, dear?" she asked, not looking up from her work. "Educational," I said, though that barely covered it. "Good. Understanding the land is important for anyone planning to stay." She glanced at me then, her pale blue eyes holding questions I wasn't ready to answer. "You are planning to stay, aren't you? This is your inheritance, after all. Your birthright." I thought about my studio apartment in Portland, the eviction notice, the dead-end job at the warehouse. What was I going back to? A life of stacking boxes for minimum wage, struggling to pay rent on a place that never felt like home? Here, at least, the strangeness had purpose. The rules made sense in their own twisted way, part of the system that had kept the Thurston family fed and housed for 4 generations. Maybe the food moved when you chewed it. Maybe the cows existed in quantities that defied mathematics, but the farm provided. It endured. "I'm thinking about it," I said honestly. Grandma smiled, and for a moment her face looked younger, the lines smoothing out like water finding level. "Good. The land needs someone young, someone willing to learn. We won't be around forever to tend things." Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the cornfield in shades of gold and amber. Soon, it would be time for rule number 1 again. No eating from the garden after sunset. Time for the day shift to end, and the night shift to begin, when different laws governed this place, and different things walked between the rows. I helped set the table, using mismatched plates that had served 3 generations of Thurstons. Normal domestic activity that felt like practice for a life I hadn't quite decided to claim yet. But as I arranged the silverware, I found myself listening for that singing from the cornfield, already planning where I'd put the cotton balls for fastest access. Maybe I was adapting faster than I'd thought. Dinner passed without incident, though I found myself chewing carefully, expecting the meat to ride between my teeth. The roast beef tasted ordinary enough, seasoned with herbs from Grandma's garden that left a metallic aftertaste on my tongue. We ate by candlelight. The power had flickered around 6 o'clock and never came back on, though neither grandparent seemed surprised. "Generator's acting up again," Grandpa explained, cutting his meat with steady hands. "Been meaning to get it looked at, but the repair fellow from town won't come out here anymore." "Why not?" "Had some trouble with the chickens last time he visited," Grandma said, her tone suggesting the matter was closed. "Pass the potatoes, dear." The potatoes had stopped bleeding, at least on the surface, though when I bit into one, warm liquid leaked onto my tongue. I swallowed quickly and reached for my water glass, trying not to think about what might be nourishing these vegetables from below. After dinner, I helped with the dishes while Grandpa tended to some paperwork at the kitchen table. Bills, supply orders, correspondence with buyers who apparently had standing orders for whatever this farm produced. The numbers didn't make sense when I glimpsed them over his shoulder. Bushels of corn sold for prices that seemed too high, quantities that exceeded what I'd seen growing in the fields. "Different markets for different products," Grandpa said, noticing my curiosity. "Some folks pay premium prices for specialty items. Organic, locally sourced, grown with traditional methods. Traditional methods. That was one way to describe it. By 9 o'clock, the sun had set completely, and the first rule took effect. No eating anything from the garden after sunset. I understood now why Grandma had insisted we finish dinner early. Once darkness fell, the vegetables changed their allegiance. We settled in the living room with oil lamps for light, the warm glow casting shifting shadows on the wood-paneled walls. Grandma worked on a cross-stitch sampler, while Grandpa read a week-old copy of the Bangor Daily News. Normal evening activities for a farm family, if you ignored the sounds coming from outside. Scratching at the windows. Soft impacts against the roof, like things landing gently from a great height. And underneath it all, a low humming that seemed to rise from the earth itself, vibrating through the floorboards and into our bones. "Storm coming," Grandpa said without looking up from his newspaper. "Always gets active before the weather turns." I glanced toward the window, but the curtains were drawn tight. "What kind of storm?" "The kind that brings changes," Grandma said, her needle pulling thread through fabric in precise, measured strokes. "Could be rain, could be wind, could be something else entirely. Best to stay inside until it passes." The scratching at the windows grew more insistent, accompanied by what sounded like whispers in a language that predated English, predated any human tongue. I found myself leaning forward, trying to make out words in the susurrus of sound. "Don't listen too close," Grandpa warned, folding his paper. "Some conversations aren't meant for human ears." Around 10:30, the power flickered back on. The overhead bulbs blazed to life, harsh and sudden after the gentle oil lamp glow. But something was wrong with the light. It had a greenish tint, and it seemed to pulse in rhythm with that underground humming. "Time for bed," Grandma announced, setting aside her needlework. "Tomorrow's Sunday, which means church, which means early morning chores." I'd forgotten about church. In my previous life, Sunday meant sleeping late and maybe grabbing brunch somewhere in Portland's Old Port. Here, apparently, it meant something else entirely. "What church do you attend?" I asked as we climbed the stairs. "Same one the family's always going to," Grandpa said. "Little white chapel about 5 miles up Route 212. Pastor Wellington's been tending the flock there for, 20 years now." "What denomination?" Grandpa and Grandma exchanged one of their looks. "Congregational, officially," Grandma said, though Pastor Wellington preaches a more inclusive theology than most. Understands that different communities have different spiritual needs. I wanted to ask what that meant, but we'd reached the top of the stairs. They wished me good night and disappeared into their bedroom, leaving me alone in the hallway with its gallery of family photos. In the strange green light, the faces in the pictures seemed to watch me more intently, their painted eyes following my movement toward my room. I closed the door and tried to settle in for the night, but sleep felt elusive. The scratching at the windows had stopped, replaced by something worse. Silence. Complete, heavy silence that pressed against my eardrums like deep water. Even the night sounds of a working farm were absent. No insects. No distant cattle lowing. No wind in the trees. Just that underground humming, so low I felt it more than heard it. Around 11:40, I gave up on sleep and crept to the window. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peer outside, expecting to see empty farmyard bathed in moonlight. Instead, I saw figures moving through the corn rows. Dozens of them, tall and thin, picking their way between the stalks with movements that reminded me of mantises hunting. They carried things, baskets, maybe, or bags, and they moved with purpose, harvesting something from the breathing plants. As I watched, one of them turned toward the house. Its face was a pale oval in the darkness, featureless except for what might have been a mouth opening and closing in silent speech. It raised one elongated arm and pointed directly at my window. I dropped the curtain and stepped back, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I looked again, the figure was gone, but the harvesting continued. The workers moved through the corn with practiced efficiency, gathering whatever crop grew in ears that should have held kernels, but contained other things instead. The clock on my nightstand read 11:52 p.m., 8 minutes until midnight, when rule number 2 would take effect. No entering the barn between midnight and 4 a.m. I wondered if the harvest workers would finish their business and retreat to that forbidden space when the deadline arrived. The thought of all those tall, thin figures filing into the barn made my skin crawl, but it also raised questions. Were they the same shapes I'd seen the night before? Were they what made the barn off-limits during those specific hours? Curiosity wrestled with common sense. I'd seen what happened to people who broke the rules. Henrik Bjornsson's grandson standing in the cornfield trying to plant his own teeth. Cousin Jimmy frozen in place for 3 days after looking at Harold's face. The rules existed for a reason, carved from generations of painful experience. But I also needed to understand what I was inheriting. If I was going to stay here, if I was going to make this place my home, I needed to know what I was agreeing to be part of. At 11:58, I made my decision. I pulled on my jeans and sneakers, moving as quietly as possible on the old floorboards. The house settled around me with creaks and sighs that sounded almost conversational, as if the building itself was commenting on my choice. I slipped downstairs and eased the back door open, stepping into the night air. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since sunset, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The harvesting in the cornfield had intensified. I could hear the soft sounds of movement, the whisper of stalks being parted, the gentle thud of things being dropped into containers. I approached the barn cautiously, staying in the shadows cast by the house. The large sliding door stood slightly ajar, just as it had been 2 nights ago. Through the gap, I could see nothing but darkness, but I could hear something inside. Not voices exactly, but a rhythmic sound like dozens of people breathing in unison. 11:59. I reached for the door handle, then stopped. My fingers hovered inches from the metal, shaking slightly in the cold air. This was it, the moment of choice. Follow the rules my family had lived by for generations, or break them to satisfy my curiosity. The church bells from town began to chime midnight, their bronze voices carrying across the rolling hills. 1, 2, 3. On the 12th chime, I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door slid open with a groan of protest, revealing the barn's interior. Oil lamps hung from the rafters, casting pools of warm light that somehow made the shadows deeper. And in those shadows, arranged in perfect rows like the corn outside, stood the harvest workers. They were tall, 7 feet at least, and impossibly thin, their limbs stretched like taffy. Their skin had the waxy pallor of things that had never seen sunlight, and their faces were smooth as river stones, featureless except for those dark openings where mouths should be. They turned toward me in unison, dozens of blank faces tilting in my direction. The rhythmic breathing stopped. For a moment, we regarded each other across the threshold. I could see their harvest containers now, woven baskets filled with the contents of corn ears, baby teeth gleaming like pearls, glass eyes that swiveled to look at me with borrowed sight. Other things I didn't want to identify, organic shapes that pulsed with their own inner light. One of the workers stepped forward, moving with that mantis-like precision I'd observed from my window. It reached into its basket and withdrew something, a single ear of corn. But this one was different. The kernels were perfect human teeth, adult molars and incisors arranged in neat rows, and at the tip, a small placard written in Grandma's careful cursive. For Ezra Thurston, welcome to the harvest. The worker extended the corn toward me, its blank face somehow conveying expectation. I understood then. This wasn't a violation of the rules. It was an initiation. The barn wasn't off limits to keep humans out during those hours. It was off limits to everyone except those being invited in. I took the corn ear, its weight solid and warm in my hands. The teeth were real, I could tell, though I had no idea whose mouths they'd come from. The workers resumed their breathing, a sound like wind through wheat fields, and gradually returned to their organized rows. I backed out of the barn and slid the door closed, the corn ear still clutched in my grip. The harvest workers would continue their activities until 4 a.m., processing whatever crop the breathing plants had produced, preparing it for markets that operated by different rules than any commodities exchange. Back in my room, I set the corn ear on my nightstand where the lamplight could illuminate it. The teeth gleamed like tiny tombstones, each one carved with microscopic symbols that hurt to look at directly. Welcome to the harvest. I was part of it now, whether I'd intended to be or not. The land had claimed me, just as it had claimed every Thurston before me. And tomorrow, I would sit in a little white chapel and listen to Pastor Wellington preach about spiritual needs and inclusive theology, pretending that receiving a corn ear full of human teeth was just another aspect of rural Maine farming. Outside, the harvest continued, and I finally fell asleep to the sound of growing things sharing their secrets with those patient enough to listen. Sunday morning arrived with the sound of church bells echoing across the valley, their bronze voices calling the faithful to worship. I woke to find the corn ear still on my nightstand, its cargo of teeth gleaming in the early sunlight. In daylight, it looked less ominous, more like an unusual craft project than evidence of supernatural agriculture. Grandma had breakfast ready, pancakes made with flour that tasted faintly of sawdust and syrup that moved sluggishly, like it contained more than just maple sugar. The coffee was normal enough, though it left grounds between my teeth that crunched with a sound like tiny bones breaking. "Bess, put on your Sunday clothes," Grandpa said, adjusting his tie with fingers that still bore traces of soil under the nails. Pastor Wellington likes his congregation to show respect for the Lord's house. I packed one decent shirt and a pair of slacks, clothes that felt foreign after 3 days of farm work. The shirt was wrinkled from being stuffed in my duffel bag, but Grandma quickly remedied that with an iron heated on the stovetop, the metal hissing against the fabric with steam that smelled like lavender and rust. The drive to church took us through countryside that looked perfectly normal in daylight. Rolling hills dotted with farmhouses, meadows where cattle grazed without mathematical complications, forests of pine and maple that showed no signs of housing anything more sinister than deer and songbirds. It was only when we passed other farms that I began to notice the subtle differences. Scarecrows that stood too straight, their burlap faces turned toward our truck as we drove by. Gardens where the vegetables grew in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than random planting. Barns with doors that were reinforced with symbols carved into the wood, not religious crosses, but older shapes that predated Christianity's arrival in Maine. "A lot of old families in this area," Grandpa said, noticing my attention. "Most of us learned to work with the land instead of against it. Makes for better neighbors, generally speaking." The Congregational Church sat at the intersection of Route 212 and Old Mill Road, a white clapboard building that could have been lifted from a postcard. Its steeple rose against the blue sky, crowned with a cross that caught the morning light. Cars filled the gravel parking lot. Pickup trucks mostly, along with a few older sedans and one pristine 1970s Chevelle that belonged to someone who either had money or took very good care of their possessions. Inside, the church looked like every New England chapel I'd ever seen in photographs. Wooden pews arranged in neat rows, tall windows that let in shafts of colored light, a simple altar adorned with seasonal flowers. About 40 people had gathered for the service, mostly older couples, but with a scattering of younger families and teenagers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Pastor Wellington stood behind the pulpit, a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd seen enough of life to accept its complexities without judgment. His eyes found mine as we took our seats in the third pew, and he nodded with the warm recognition of someone greeting an expected visitor. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying easily through the small space. "Today, we gather to reflect on the ancient covenant between humanity and the divine, and on our responsibility to honor the agreements our forebears made with forces beyond our understanding." The congregation murmured agreement, but their response felt different from typical church services I remembered from childhood. More fervent, more personal, as if Pastor Wellington was discussing matters of immediate practical concern rather than abstract theology. "The book of Ecclesiastes tells us that to everything there is a season," the pastor continued, "and a time to every purpose under heaven, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to honor the old ways, and a time to welcome new members into our community of faith and stewardship." His eyes found mine again, and I realized this sermon was at least partially for my benefit. "Our ancestors knew truths that modern society has forgotten," Pastor Wellington said, warming to his theme. "They understood that the earth itself is alive, that it has needs and desires, that it forms partnerships with those wise enough to listen. The Passamaquoddy, who first hunted these woods, knew this. The early settlers who learned from them knew this, and we, their descendants, continue to honor those relationships today." A woman in the front pew, elderly, with white hair pinned in a tight bun, turned to look at me with curious eyes. Others followed suit, until half the congregation was studying me, with expressions that ranged from welcoming to appraising. I felt like a specimen being examined for fitness. "Some of you may have noticed that Silas and Mercy Thurston have their grandson visiting," Pastor Wellington said, making the inspection official. "Ezra has come home to the family farm, perhaps to consider taking up his inheritance and carrying on traditions that have sustained his family for 4 generations. The congregation murmured appreciation, and several people nodded encouragingly in my direction. "Change is always difficult," the pastor continued. "Young people today are taught to question everything, to demand scientific explanations for phenomena that transcend scientific understanding. They're encouraged to see tradition as superstition, to view their elders' wisdom as outdated thinking that should be abandoned in favor of modern methods." He paused, letting his words settle over the gathered worshippers. "But here in Aroostook County, we've learned that some kinds of knowledge can't be found in textbooks. Some relationships require faith rather than understanding. Some covenants are sealed not with signatures, but with acceptance of responsibility that passes from one generation to the next." The sermon continued for another 20 minutes, weaving together biblical passages with references to indigenous wisdom and the particular challenges of farming in northern Maine. Pastor Wellington spoke of stewardship and sacrifice, of the need to honor agreements made by previous generations, even when their terms seemed strange to modern sensibilities. When the service ended, the congregation didn't rush for the door. Instead, they lingered, forming small groups that gradually coalesced around my grandparents and me. I found myself shaking hands with neighbors whose farms surrounded ours, listening to introductions and brief histories. "Ezra, meet Dorothy Kellum," Grandma said, guiding me toward the white-haired woman from the front pew. Her family's been working the land north of us since the 1890s. Mrs. Kellum's handshake was firm despite her age, her pale blue eyes sharp with intelligence. Pleasure to meet you, young man. Your grandfathers told us you might be staying on permanently. I'm considering it, I said, though the words felt strange coming out of my mouth. 3 days ago, I'd never imagined living anywhere but a city. Good, she said with satisfaction. The Bjornson place has been sitting empty since old Henrik passed last winter. Too many properties going fallow. Too many young people running off to Portland or Boston thinking city life is easier. Other neighbors introduced themselves. The Parkers, whose dairy operation apparently followed similar unconventional methods. The Whitcombs, who raised sheep that produced wool in colors that didn't occur naturally. The Gagnons, whose apple orchard fruited year-round, despite Maine's harsh winters. Each family had their own version of the rules, their own accommodation with whatever forces governed this particular corner of the world. They spoke in euphemisms and careful phrases, but the meaning was clear. This was a community that had learned to coexist with the supernatural, and they expected newcomers to adapt or leave. Your great-grandfather was a smart man, said Tom Parker, whose massive hands suggested decades of farm work. Could have tried to fight the land, try to impose modern agriculture on soil that had its own ideas. Instead, he listened, learned, found ways to work with what was already here. What exactly was already here? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. The group fell silent, exchanging glances that suggested I'd asked a question that didn't have a simple response. Different things in different places, Mrs. Kellum said finally. Your farm sits on what the Passamaquoddy called a thin place. Somewhere the boundary between worlds isn't as solid as it should be. Makes for very fertile soil, but also means you're sharing the space with residents who were here first. Residents? The harvest workers you met last night, Grandpa said quietly. Among others. I stared at him. You knew? Of course I knew. You think we don't keep track of who goes wandering around after midnight? He smiled, but there was relief in his expression. The fact that they gave you a gift instead of adding you to their collection means you're family now, whether you understand it or not. The drive home passed in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. The farmhouse looked different when we pulled into the driveway. More settled, more permanent. As if my acceptance by the community had somehow solidified my claim to the property. Rest up this afternoon, Grandpa advised as we climbed the front porch steps. Tonight's the new moon, which means it's harvest time proper. You'll want to be ready. Ready for what? To help, Grandma said simply. You're part of the operation now, which means you've got responsibilities. The workers can gather the crop, but they need human hands for the processing, the packaging, the arrangements with buyers. What exactly are we sowing? Specialty items, Grandpa said. Organic materials with unique properties, grown using traditional methods passed down through generations. There's a market for everything, long as you know where to look. That afternoon, I sat on the front porch with a glass of lemonade that tasted like lemons mixed with copper pennies, watching the cornstalks sway in the breeze. Their breathing had become more noticeable, more urgent, as if they sensed the approaching harvest. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of my willingness to accept this inheritance. But for now, I was content to sit and watch the land that had claimed me, wondering what my father would think about his son, becoming a keeper of supernatural agriculture. The corn whispered secrets in a language older than English, and I found myself beginning to understand. The new moon brought darkness so complete, it seemed solid, pressing against the farmhouse windows like black velvet. No stars penetrated the cloud cover, and even the distant glow from Presque Isle had vanished behind the rolling hills. This was the kind of darkness that existed before electric lights, when night meant true absence of illumination. I'd tried to nap during the afternoon but found sleep elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those tall harvest workers arranged in their perfect rows, their blank faces turning toward me in unison. The corn ear of teeth sat on my dresser, a reminder that I'd crossed a threshold I couldn't uncross. Around 8 o'clock, Grandpa knocked on my door. "Time to get ready," he said, his voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard before. "Dig night ahead of us." Downstairs, Grandma was packing supplies into canvas bags, thick work gloves, mason jars of various sizes, rolls of brown paper tied with string, and metal tools I couldn't identify. She moved with practiced efficiency, checking items off a mental list accumulated over decades of harvest nights. "Put these on," she said, handing me a pair of gloves that felt heavier than leather should. When I examined them more closely, I realized they weren't leather at all. The material had a texture like snakeskin, but warm to the touch and slightly luminescent in the lamplight. "What are they made of?" "Better not to ask too many questions tonight," Grandpa said, pulling on his own pair. "Some knowledge comes with responsibilities you might not be ready for." We ate a light dinner: bread and butter, cold ham, vegetables from jars that Grandma had preserved during previous seasons. The food tasted normal, almost aggressively so, as if someone had decided to serve the most mundane meal possible before venturing into the supernatural. At 9:30, we made our final preparations. Grandpa loaded a wheelbarrow with empty crates and handed me a canvas satchel that clinked with the sound of glass containers. Grandma filled a thermos with coffee that smelled like pine needles and filled another with something that looked like water, but caught the light differently. "The workers will handle the gathering," Grandpa explained as we stepped outside. "Our job is processing and packaging. Each type of harvest requires different handling, different preservation methods." The temperature had dropped again, and our breath came out in clouds that dissipated too quickly, as if the air was hungrier than usual. The farmyard looked different in the complete darkness. Shapes seemed larger, distances stretched or compressed without warning, and familiar landmarks had rearranged themselves into new configurations. But it was the cornfield that commanded attention. The stalks were glowing, not brightly, just a subtle phosphorescence that outlined each plant against the darkness. The entire field pulsed with synchronized light. Hundreds of stalks breathing in perfect rhythm, their luminescence flaring and dimming like a massive slow heartbeat. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Grandma said, her voice filled with genuine appreciation. 40 years I've been watching harvest nights, and it still takes my breath away. The barn doors stood wide open, and inside I could see the harvest workers already at their tasks. But tonight there were more of them. Dozens, maybe 50, arranged in efficient work lines. Some carried the familiar baskets, but others pushed wheeled carts, or carried wooden crates marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "Your job tonight is sorting and packing," Grandpa said, leading me toward a long table set up just inside the barn doors. "The workers will bring the harvest to you, and you'll prepare it for shipment according to these specifications." He handed me a clipboard with pages of instructions written in multiple hands. Grandma's careful cursive mixed with Grandpa's blocky printing and older writing that might have belonged to my great-grandfather. The specifications were precise but bizarre. Baby teeth, intact. Pack 144 per mason jar, fill with saline solution, seal with red wax. Glass eyes, matched pairs. Wrap individually in silk, place in wooden boxes lined with black felt. Memory fragments, crystallized. handle with silver tongs only, store in lead-lined containers, do not examine contents. Bone splinters, human. Sort by age, infant, child, adult, elderly. Bundle in groups of 7, tie with hemp cord. The list continued for 3 pages, covering materials I couldn't have imagined and didn't want to understand. But as the first harvest workers approached our station, carrying their carefully gathered crops, I found myself falling into the rhythm of the work. The baby teeth came first, each one perfectly clean despite their bloody roots. I counted them into jars with mechanical precision, trying not to think about the children who'd lost them or how they'd ended up growing in corn ears. The saline solution came from one of Grandma's unmarked bottles, and the red wax melted under a candle flame that burned blue instead of orange. Next came the glass eyes, dozens of pairs in every color imaginable. They tracked movement even when removed from their corn ear sockets, following my hands as I wrapped them in silk that felt like spider webs. Some of the eyes were clearly human, but others belonged to creatures I couldn't identify. Cat eyes the size of marbles. Bird eyes that held intelligence no wild thing should possess. And some that weren't quite either, as if evolution had tried different experiments in these particular specimens. The work was hypnotic. Sort, count, package, seal. The harvest workers brought endless varieties of their strange crop, and I processed each type according to the detailed instructions. Memory fragments that looked like crystallized tears and felt warm through the special gloves. Fingernail clippings that whispered when disturbed. Hair that moved on its own, trying to braid itself back together. Time lost meaning. The barn filled with completed packages, each one labeled with shipping addresses that ranged from post office boxes in Salem, Massachusetts, to private residences in New Orleans, Prague, and places whose names were written in alphabets I didn't recognize. "You're a natural at this," Grandma said during a brief break, offering me coffee from the thermos. The liquid tasted like pine and earth, and something darker that made my teeth ache. Takes most folks several harvest seasons to develop the proper rhythm. "Where does all this go?" I asked, gesturing at the growing piles of packages. "Collectors," Grandpa said simply. "People who understand the value of authentic materials harvested using traditional methods. There's always been a market for genuine articles, especially among those who practice the old arts." "Old arts?" "Magic, some call it, though that's a crude term. More like applied knowledge about how reality actually works, beneath all the modern assumptions about what's possible." He took a sip from his own cup. "Your great-grandfather started developing these markets during the Depression, when regular crops weren't enough to keep the farm afloat. Turned out there were plenty of folks willing to pay premium prices for materials you couldn't find anywhere else. Around midnight, the pace of harvest intensified. The workers moved faster, their baskets filled with increasingly exotic specimens. I found myself handling things that defied classification, organic shapes that pulsed with their own inner light, geometric forms that folded in ways that hurt my eyes, containers of fluid that reflected images of places I'd never seen. That's when I made my first mistake. One of the memory fragments, a crystallized tear the size of a marble, slipped from my silver tongs and rolled off the table. Without thinking, I reached out to catch it with my bare hand. The moment my skin touched the crystal, images flooded my mind. A little girl's birthday party, but the faces of the guests kept changing, melting into each other like wax in heat. A wedding ceremony where the bride's dress was woven from spider silk and morning fog. A funeral where the deceased sat up in their coffin and asked for directions to somewhere called the Underneath. I jerked my hand back, but the damage was done. The memory fragment had absorbed something from me. I could feel a piece of my own past being drawn into its crystalline structure, mixing with whatever experiences it already contained. Ezra! Grandma's voice cut through the disorientation. Don't touch the memory fragments directly. They'll take as much as they give. But it was too late. The crystal had grown slightly larger, now containing not just the borrowed memories of strangers, but a fragment of my own childhood. The day my parents brought me to this farm when I was 7, the overwhelming smell of hay and animals, the way Grandpa's hands had felt warm and safe when he'd lifted me onto his shoulders. The memory was gone from my own mind now, existing only in the crystallized tear that would be shipped to some collector who specialized in childhood experiences. It's all right, Grandpa said, seeing my distress. Happens to everyone eventually. The land takes what it needs to keep the harvest rich. That's part of the agreement our family made. We give a little of ourselves to ensure the crops stay fertile. I stared at the crystal, trying to remember what I'd lost. But memory is like that. Once it's gone, you can't even recall what was missing. The harvest continued until dawn, when the first pale light began to filter through the barn doors. The workers finished their tasks with the same synchronized precision they'd shown all night, filing back into the cornfield as the stalks gradually stopped glowing. By sunrise, we'd filled 300 packages with materials that would find their way to practitioners of arts, older than written history. The barn looked normal again, just another farm building housing hay and equipment and the ordinary tools of agricultural life. But I was different now, not just because of the lost memory, but because I'd participated in something that connected me to the land in ways I was only beginning to understand. I was part of the harvest now, part of the ancient agreement that sustained the farm. And tomorrow night, when the moon was just a silver crescent, we'd do it all again. I'm writing this on harvest night, sitting at the same kitchen table where Grandma first handed me the rules. The oil lamp flickers beside my notebook, casting shifting shadows that dance across pages filled with shipping addresses and processing instructions. Outside, the corn stalks breathe their slow rhythm while the workers move between the rows, gathering tonight's crop with patient efficiency. The eviction notice from my Portland apartment arrived last week, forwarded by the Postal Service. I read it once, then fed it to the kitchen fire. That life belongs to someone else now, someone who counted warehouse inventory instead of baby teeth, someone who worried about rent instead of whether the memory fragments were properly sealed in their lead containers. Grandpa's arthritis has worsened since that first harvest night. His hands shake when he tries to handle the delicate materials, and twice this month he's needed help reading the shipping labels. Grandma moves slower too, though she still bakes bread that whispers secrets and tends vegetables that pulse with borrowed life. They're preparing me to take over completely, not just the processing and packaging, but the deeper responsibilities, maintaining the agreements, negotiating with the things that live beneath the soil, ensuring the land stays fertile for another generation. Pastor Wellington visits once a week now, ostensibly for coffee and conversation, but really to assess my readiness for what he calls full stewardship. I've learned to sleep through the singing from the cornfield. The cotton balls sit unused in their mason jar beside my bed. Sometimes I even find myself humming along, though I can never remember the melody once the voices stop. My dreams are different now, filled with root systems that span continents and harvests that feed hungers I'm only beginning to understand. The memory I lost that first night has been replaced by others, though I can't tell if they're my own or borrowed from the crystallized tears I handle each harvest. I remember a childhood birthday party where the guests had no faces, a graduation ceremony held in an underground chamber lit by phosphorescent moss, a wedding where the rings were made from teeth and the vows were spoken in languages that predate human speech. Sometimes I wonder if these false memories belong to previous Thurston children, absorbed by the land and redistributed to maintain family continuity. The thought should disturb me, but it doesn't. I am who I need to be for this place, shaped by its requirements rather than random chance. My hands have developed calluses from handling the harvest materials, thick patches of skin that don't feel pain when I touch things that would burn ordinary flesh. The scars form patterns I recognize from the shipping crates, symbols that mark me as belonging to something larger than individual identity. Yesterday, a young woman knocked on our door. College student from the University of Maine, writing a thesis on rural folklore and agricultural traditions. She had that eager academic look, all notebooks and recording equipment and confidence that education could explain away anything strange she encountered. Grandma served her tea made from herbs that grow between the corn rows. I watched the girl's eyes glaze over as she drank, her questions becoming vaguer, less focused. She left after an hour with a handful of pleasant but forgettable anecdotes about traditional farming methods, the kind of sanitized folklore that fills academic papers without touching actual truth. But she'll be back. They always come back, drawn by dreams they can't quite remember and hungers they can't name. Some will be strong enough to join the harvest. Others will contribute in different ways, adding their memories to the crystallized tears or their essence to the soil that feeds the breathing corn. The land provides, but it also takes. That's the bargain every Thurston has made, and now it's mine to honor. The workers are returning to the barn, their baskets full of tonight's crop. Time to put away my pen and begin the sorting. Somewhere in those containers are materials that will feed practitioners in Prague and Salem, collectors in New Orleans, and places whose names exist in no earthly atlas. I am Ezra Thurston, keeper of the harvest, guardian of agreements older than memory, and I am home.